The cold wind carried a trace of hay, dust, and the faint scent of manure, drifting across the pens of Black Hollow Auction, a name that echoed through every ranch from Montana to Texas. It was the kind of place where reputations were built or crushed in a matter of minutes. Ranchers with sun-leathered faces and stoic eyes lined the railings, coffee in hand, boots planted firmly in the dirt. They weren't here to make friends. They were here to judge. In the middle of the arena stood a Colt, scrawny, knock-kneed, with a coat still dull from a rough birth. His legs trembled slightly as he stood near the old man who had brought him. His name was Lucky, though that name felt more like a joke today than anything else. A soft hush fell over the crowd, followed by an eruption of muffled chuckles. "That thing looks like it crawled out of a fence post," someone muttered near the fence line. "He won't last a week in the mountains," another scoffed. The old man standing beside the Colt was Walter Briggs, a worn figure carved by years of sun, storms, and sacrifice. He didn't flinch at the words. He'd heard worse. But inside, something tensed, something old and wounded. Walter had raised horses his whole life. He knew when an animal was special. And even though Lucky looked like nothing more than a mistake, Walter saw something in his eyes, a quiet fire, hidden beneath the bone and fear. The auctioneer didn't hide his doubt either. He barely looked at the Colt before tapping his microphone. Starting bid, $20. Anyone? Anyone at all? Silence. Then laughter. Walter clenched his jaw. Across the pen, Harlon McCoy, owner of the prestigious Dusthorn stockyard, leaned on the rail, chewing the inside of his cheek with smug satisfaction. "Briggs must have finally lost it," he said to a companion. "Bringing a glue stick to a horse auction." The insult didn't go unnoticed. Walter turned slowly, locking eyes with Harlon. They had history, most of it bitter. Years ago, they'd been friends, partners even. But a broken deal, and the death of Walter's wife, had torn them apart. Harlon had gone on to build an empire. Walter had faded into silence and dust. No one bid. The auctioneer tapped the mic again, now visibly annoyed. "Come on, folks. $20. This is a living horse, after all." Still nothing. And then, just as the man was about to wave Lucky off the platform, a thin voice rose from the back row. "I'll take him." All heads turned. It was Ethan, Walter's 12-year-old grandson, barely visible beneath his oversized ball cap and hand-me-down boots. He held out a crumpled bill, a 20. The crowd laughed harder now, but the sound was different. Pity, amusement, maybe even discomfort. No one expected the kid to speak up, and no one expected Walter to nod. "Sold," the auctioneer said quickly. "To the boy with the big heart." As they walked away from the pen, Lucky stumbling behind, Walter kept his gaze forward. He could feel the eyes burning holes into his back. He could hear Harlon's whisper, "That old fool just bought himself a burden." But Walter didn't care. In the quiet shuffle of hooves and boots, he whispered to the Colt without turning his head, "Let them laugh, Lucky. Let them all laugh." What no one knew, what not even Walter knew yet, was that this rejected Colt would become something no one could have imagined. And everything was about to change. The ride home from Black Hollow Auction was quiet. Walter's old pickup rattled down the gravel road, its shocks long past retirement. Lucky stood in the open trailer behind them, swaying with every bump, legs still unsure, ribs showing. Ethan sat beside his grandfather, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the road like he was bracing for something. He didn't say a word, not even when the silence began to feel heavy. Walter finally spoke as they passed the weather-beaten sign for Briggs Hollow Ranch, faded and leaning to one side. "Your grandma used to say every soul's got a purpose. Sometimes you find it when the world turns its back on you." He wasn't sure if he meant it for the boy or the horse, or himself. Maybe all three. Back at the ranch, The air was dry and still. The barns groaned in the breeze, and the old corral hadn't seen a new horse in years. Claire, Walter's daughter and Ethan's mother, stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching them unload the colt. Her jaw tightened as soon as she saw him. "You spent money we don't have on that?" she asked, not angry, just tired. She worked 2 jobs and still helped Walter keep the ranch running. Hope didn't come easy anymore. Ethan led Lucky carefully into the stable, his hands gentle, his voice low. "He just needs time, Mom." The colt flinched at the shadows, unsure of his footing. But he followed the boy without resistance. Something about Ethan's quiet strength seemed to calm him. Walter ran a hand along Lucky's back, feeling the sharpness of his bones. "He's got a fire in him. I've seen that look before." Claire sighed, looking at her father. "You saw it in that stallion you lost in '92. He broke your ribs and nearly cost us the ranch." Walter didn't argue. He just kept his eyes on the colt. "This one's different." That night, the wind picked up and howled through the rafters. Lucky stood alone in the stall, ears twitching with every creak of the barn. Outside, Walter stared out over the pasture, hat in hand, jaw set firm. Behind him, Ethan watched silently through the screen door. None of them could sleep. Something unspoken was beginning to stir, not just in the colt, but in all of them. And deep down, Walter knew, this was more than just a rescue. This was a second chance. A week passed, and Lucky struggled with every sunrise. His steps were clumsy, his appetite faint, and his frame still fragile. But there was something in his eyes, an ember of fight, that refused to dim. Ethan took to waking early before school, brushing the colt's coat with slow, patient strokes. He talked to Lucky like an old friend, telling him things he couldn't tell anyone else. About his father walking out. About his mom crying at night. About how sometimes he didn't feel strong enough to carry the silence in the house. Walter watched from the barn doorway most mornings, saying nothing. He saw the bond forming between the boy and the colt, something delicate but fierce. Lucky still spooked at sudden sounds and refused to be led by anyone else, but Ethan? Ethan had become his anchor. Walter knew that kind of connection. He had it once, years ago, with a horse that nearly won him national recognition, before fate took it all away. On a cloudy Wednesday, Walter drove into town to pick up supplies. He hadn't been to Dusthorn Stockyard in nearly 2 years, ever since Harlon McCoy's operation had swallowed up half the local livestock business. Walking in felt like stepping into enemy territory. The polished office, the clean branding, the employees dressed more like salesmen than ranch hands. Everything about Dusthorn was colder now, shinier, artificial. Harlon spotted him immediately. "Well, well, if it ain't the ghost of Briggs Hollow." His voice was rich with mockery. "Still feeding that bag of bones you dragged out of Black Hollow?" Walter kept his voice even. "I feed what's worth saving." Harlon smirked. "I heard the colt's still limping. Hate to say I told you so, but—" "You don't hate it one bit," Walter cut in, narrowing his eyes. "You just can't stand the thought of something good coming from someone you wrote off." The room grew quiet. On the drive home, Walter's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Dusthorn wasn't just thriving, they were expanding. The word around town was that Harlon had plans to take over the Silver Buckle lot next, which would leave Briggs Hollow completely isolated from the livestock circuit. If Lucky didn't show promise soon, Walter might not have another auction left to turn to. As he turned into the ranch gate, he spotted Ethan in the corral, guiding Lucky in small, careful circles. The colt was still rough, still learning. But for the first time, his steps looked steadier, more sure. Walter didn't say a word. He just watched and hoped. Early spring brought a new kind of urgency to Briggs Hollow Ranch. The days were longer, the air thick with pollen and hope. Walter had cleared out the old round pen, pulling weeds with bare hands and rebuilding the broken fence slats himself. It wasn't much, but it was enough, a place where Lucky could train. Not for show. Not yet. But for survival. Every afternoon, after school, Ethan stepped into that pen with the Colt. He never forced him, never raised his voice. He used patience instead of pressure. He learned to read Lucky's body, the way his ears flicked when nervous, the way his breathing changed when unsure. They moved in rhythm, awkward at first, but gradually more in tune. Walter watched from the edge, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. He didn't interrupt. He knew better. Some things can't be taught out loud. Still, not everything was going well. Lucky had developed a stubborn limp in his back right leg. Dr. Ray Tucker, the aging vet who'd worked with Walter for decades, came out to examine him. He crouched beside the Colt with a grunt, running his hand slowly down the leg. Could be a growth issue. Could be trauma from birth. Hard to say. But he's got spirit, Walt. That matters more than you think. Walter nodded, but deep down, worry settled in his chest like a stone. If the limp didn't improve, Lucky wouldn't be able to compete, train, or sell. He'd just be a burden. And burdens were the last thing Briggs Hollow could afford. The ranch was on the edge. Water bills were behind, and the tractor hadn't started in 2 weeks. One evening, Claire found Walter sitting by the barn, staring out into the dusky pasture. She handed him a cold bottle of beer and sat beside him without a word. For a long time, the only sounds were the wind rustling through the grass and the distant clink of Lucky's hooves inside the pen. Finally, she spoke. "Why are you holding on to this so hard?" Walter didn't look at her. "Because it's the only thing that feels alive around here." She didn't press him. She understood more than she let on. Later that night, thunder rolled in the distance. Lucky, restless in the stall, paced as if sensing something shifting. Outside, Ethan stared out the window of his small bedroom, the old trophy from his father's rodeo days still gathering dust on the shelf. He whispered into the dark, almost a prayer. "Please don't give up on us." And in the stillness that followed, something in the wind seemed to answer. A week later, the letter came. Folded in an unmarked envelope, it was left in Walter's mailbox with nothing more than his name scratched across the front. Inside, typed in sharp ink on stiff paper, was a notice. Briggs Hollow Ranch had 30 days to settle past dues or face seizure of assets. The bank wasn't bluffing this time. Claire found the letter first and stormed into the kitchen, slamming it on the table where Walter was eating quietly. "You said we had time," she snapped, voice cracking. "You said you had a plan." Walter didn't raise his voice. He just looked down at his calloused hands. "I thought I did." Truth was, he'd been banking on Lucky turning a corner, physically and financially. But even with Ethan's dedication and the vet's therapy sessions, the limp hadn't fully gone away. The training was steady, yes, but not exceptional. Not yet. And without that, the Colt had no future in the ring. No value at market. No shot. Later that evening, Walter hitched up the trailer and told Ethan they were taking a ride. He didn't say where. The boy climbed in without asking. The road was long and silent until a wooden sign emerged from the trees. Broken Gate Auction House. The place had a reputation. Cheap deals, desperate sellers, and buyers who weren't interested in potential, just weight and price. Ethan's eyes filled with confusion as they pulled in. "Grandpa, are we selling him?" Walter didn't answer right away. His silence said enough. Ethan jumped out of the truck and ran toward the trailer, hands gripping the latch before Walter could even open it. "You said he had fire. You said he was different." His voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. Walter's voice was low and tired. "And I still believe that. But belief doesn't pay debts." Before he could say more, an old man approached, a buyer with a thick belt buckle and a sharper attitude. He eyed Lucky briefly and sneered. "That's the Colt from Black Hollow, ain't it? Still walking like he's stuck in a ditch." He pulled out a checkbook. "I'll give you 50 and not a penny more." Walter stared at him, then at the horse, then at Ethan, whose eyes were pleading, shining with tears he refused to let fall. Time slowed. All around them, auctioneers shouted numbers, cattle bellowed, and the wind picked up dust and tension in the air. And in that one breathless moment, Walter reached for the trailer gate. But instead of opening it, he locked it shut. "We're not done," he muttered, and drove away. 2 days after turning back from Broken Gate Auction House, Walter received a phone call from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Chase DeWitt, now a rising name in the world of professional horse training, had heard, through the small-town grapevine, that Walter Briggs had a colt worth watching. At first, Walter thought it was some kind of cruel joke. But Chase's voice was serious. "Bring him to Silver Buckle Lot this weekend," he said. "I want to see what he's really made of." Silver Buckle wasn't just another pen or auction yard. It was where champions were discovered. It was polished, intimidating, and full of trainers who didn't shake hands with men who hadn't won anything in years. Walter hesitated. Lucky was still limping slightly. He still lacked polish, finesse. But deep inside, something stirred, a mix of pride and fear. He hadn't been invited to a place like that since before Claire was born. Ethan begged to come along. "He won't move without me," he insisted. Walter agreed. And on Saturday morning, as the sky was still bleeding orange, they loaded Lucky onto the trailer and made the long, quiet drive across state lines. Every mile felt like a gamble. Every bump in the road reminded Walter that this could end badly, not just for Lucky, but for everything they were holding on to. When they arrived, Chase was already waiting, young, confident, wearing a spotless denim shirt and a clipboard under his arm. He gave Lucky a once-over and raised a brow. "He's rough," he said, "but I've seen worse turn gold." Then, to Walter's surprise, he looked at Ethan. "You work with him?" Ethan nodded. "Every day. Then you're riding him." Walter blinked. "He's just a boy." Chase shook his head. "No, he's the bond. And the horse trusts him. That's what wins." Inside the arena, the air was thick with heat and skepticism. Other riders whispered, eyes flicking toward the underfed colt and the skinny kid climbing into the saddle. But when Ethan gave the signal, Lucky responded, slow at first, cautious, but moving with purpose. His limp had faded to a slight hitch. His stride was low but determined. And every time he faltered, Ethan's calm voice steadied him. They didn't win that day. But when it ended, Chase pulled Walter aside, face serious. "There's something here. He's not a racehorse. But he's a fighter. And I think I can get him ready for Iron Spur Arena in 6 weeks. That purse could save your ranch." Walter said nothing. But in his chest, something finally exhaled. Training for Iron Spur Arena pushed everyone past their limits. Chase didn't treat Lucky like a fragile case. He treated him like a competitor. Early mornings turned into long, grueling afternoons. The colt struggled through complex drills, sweat darkening his chestnut coat, ears back, body aching. But something had changed. Lucky didn't give up. And neither did Ethan. Claire watched it all from the sidelines, still cautious, still unsure. She brought sandwiches and water in silence, only speaking when necessary. One evening, after Ethan and Lucky collapsed side by side in the hay, she pulled Walter aside. "What if you're wrong?" she asked. "What if this is just one more dream that doesn't come true?" Walter looked at her with tired eyes. "Then we go down fighting." Chase saw the cracks in Lucky's stride but didn't call them out. He saw the pain in the boy's shoulders but pushed harder anyway. "This isn't about flash," he said during one late training session. "It's about grit. That crowd at Iron Spur? They don't care where you came from. They care if you show up." But grit had its price. One morning, Lucky stumbled hard during a tight turn. His right leg buckled, and he let out a sharp cry that stopped everyone in their tracks. Ethan rushed to his side, heart in his throat. Chase and Walter followed, eyes locked on the leg that had always been the problem. Dust swirled around them like smoke from a fire nobody could put out. Dr. Ray Tucker was called in again. He ran his hands down Lucky's leg, slower this time, more deliberate. After a long pause, he stood and faced Walter. "There's no break," he said. "But he's pushing too hard, too fast. If he keeps going like this, he won't make it to Iron Spur. He might not make it at all." The air in the barn turned heavy. Ethan didn't cry, but his voice trembled. "We were so close." Walter put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Close doesn't mean finished." Then he turned to Chase. "We slow it down. We don't stop, we just listen. To the horse. To the boy. To the ground under us." That night, Lucky lay quietly in the stall, eyes half closed, breathing shallow but steady. Ethan sat beside him, his hand resting on the colt's neck. And somewhere between exhaustion and silence, an unspoken vow passed between them both. They would get to Iron Spur, even if it broke them first. With Iron Spur Arena just 10 days away, Chase made a bold decision. He arranged for a trial run at the Crowbar Pen, a smaller but respected proving ground for young riders and underdog horses. It wasn't flashy, but it was known for exposing weakness and testing real potential. If Lucky could hold his own there, they'd know he had a fighting chance. Walter wasn't convinced. "This ain't just a test for the horse," he muttered to Chase as they loaded the trailer. "It's a test for all of us." The day was overcast, the sky painted in muted grays. The arena at the Crowbar Pen was packed with onlookers, trainers, scouts, skeptics. They'd heard whispers about the colt from Black Hollow. Some came to laugh. Others came to watch something fail. But Ethan stood tall, nerves hidden behind the quiet confidence he'd earned through every scrape and scar over the past weeks. Lucky, still lean but stronger now, stepped into the ring like he belonged there. The announcer barely paused before calling their names. Rider, Ethan Briggs. Mount, Lucky, owned by Walter Briggs of Briggs Hollow Ranch. A few chuckles echoed from the bleachers. But once the gate opened, all noise faded. Ethan clicked his tongue gently, and Lucky surged forward, not with speed, but with heart. His strides weren't perfect. The limp was there, faint but visible. Still he pressed on, weaving through the course with gritty focus. Walter watched from the fence, heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. Claire stood beside him, arms crossed, face unreadable. Chase leaned forward, whispering like a prayer, "Come on, kid, come on." Halfway through the run, Lucky hesitated at a sharp turn. A collective breath held in the crowd. Ethan didn't panic. He leaned forward, whispered something only the colt could hear, and Lucky adjusted, smooth and sure. The run wasn't fast. It wasn't flawless. But it was honest, real. When they crossed the final marker, a hush hung in the air for just a second, then a soft ripple of applause. It wasn't wild cheering, but it was respect. Back at the trailer, as Lucky cooled down, Chase approached Walter with a rare smile. "He's ready." Walter didn't smile back. His eyes were glassy, his hands shaking just slightly. "No, they're ready." He looked at Ethan, now brushing down Lucky, both covered in sweat and dust, bonded by something no one else could see. For the first time in years, Walter believed again, not in luck, but in the power of not giving up. Iron Spur was waiting. The morning of the Iron Spur Arena event arrived wrapped in fog. The parking lot buzzed with trailers, boots crunching gravel, and the occasional burst of laughter from confident ranchers. But in the Briggs camp, everything was quiet. Walter, Claire, Ethan, and Chase stood beside Lucky's stall, each one lost in their own storm of thoughts. This wasn't just a competition. It was their last shot at saving everything. Lucky was calm. Still thin by competition standards, but his eyes were clear, his stride even. Whatever weight he carried, it no longer dragged him down. Ethan brushed him slowly, talking softly, as he always did. "Doesn't matter what they think. We know who you are." The boy's voice cracked, but his hands never shook. He was no longer just a kid riding a broken horse. He was a partner, a teammate, a believer. Walter stepped away from the group, standing near the edge of the arena where banners waved in the cold wind. That's when he heard the voice he least wanted to hear. Well, thought this old ranch died already." Harlon McCoy, clean boots, smug grin, and not a wrinkle out of place. His horse, a perfectly bred showpiece from Dusthorn Stockyard, stood behind him like a trophy. Walter didn't flinch. "We're still breathing," he said quietly. Harlon smirked. "Then watch carefully. Might learn how winners work." Inside the arena, the crowd packed in. Bleachers groaned under the weight of hundreds. Names were called. Rounds completed. Then it was Ethan's turn. When the announcer said, "Next up, Lucky, ridden by Ethan Briggs," a murmur spread through the stands. Everyone remembered. The colt from Black Hollow. The reject. The joke. But when the gate opened, all of that vanished. Lucky didn't bolt. He flowed. His gait wasn't perfect, but it had power, grace, intelligence. Ethan guided him like they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. The crowd leaned in. Obstacle after obstacle, Lucky moved with determination. Not fast, not flashy, but with heart. Real heart. Then came the final corner. A tight, demanding turn. The same type that nearly broke him weeks ago. The crowd tensed. Ethan gave one word. Lucky turned, clean. Silence, then thunderous applause. Walter closed his eyes. He didn't need a scoreboard. He knew what had just happened. But it wasn't over yet. Because someone was about to make a choice that would change everything. One tied to the past, to a truth buried deeper than pride or land. And it was coming for Walter, faster than he could run. The day after Iron Spur, the phone at Briggs Hollow rang just after dawn. Walter answered it with a voice still hoarse from emotion and dust. On the other end, a representative from Red Rock Bitters Ring, one of the most prestigious livestock auctions in the region, spoke with urgency and admiration. "We heard about Lucky's run. Word is, people are calling him the Heart Horse. We'd like to feature him in the headline event next weekend. Prime spot. Big money. National eyes." Walter didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, where Ethan was leading Lucky through the pasture, both of them walking like they'd aged 10 years and earned every line. Claire stood by the barn, arms folded, expression softening as she watched her son. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension in her shoulders, just quiet pride. But the decision wasn't about money anymore. That afternoon, Walter met Chase at the barn and handed him an envelope. "I'm pulling Lucky from Red Rock," he said simply. Chase stared at him. "You realize what you're turning down?" Walter nodded. "I didn't raise that horse for a price tag. He gave my grandson something I couldn't. He gave me something back too. That's worth more than any purse." He paused. "Besides, the ranch is safe now. The community took notice. I've got offers coming in, real ones. But more than that, I finally remembered why I started all this." 3 days later, a black truck rolled up the long dirt drive. The driver stepped out slowly, Samuel Caldwell, a name Walter hadn't heard in nearly 40 years. They'd ridden together as young cowboys. Lost touch after the war, after Walter's wife passed. But Sam had seen the news. He'd watched the run. And he'd come with a checkbook, not for the horse, but to invest in Walter's vision. "I'm not here to buy," he said. "I'm here to build something again, with you." Ethan watched from the corral, Lucky beside him, both of them quiet, still, and somehow wiser than their years. Walter joined them after Sam left, putting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You didn't just save this ranch," he said. "You reminded me who I was." Lucky nuzzled the boy's side gently. And as the sun dipped behind the hills of Briggs Hollow, casting long shadows across the pasture, there was no more laughter from doubters, no more weight from the past, only a new beginning, born not from luck, but from grit, love, and the heart of a horse no one believed in.